Welcome to TaNaCh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament. Joining us again, Rabbi Michael the Man Skobac. Welcome back, Skobac, as usual. Today's topic is going to be quite a spicy one, apparently. Oh boy, I'm glad you didn't write that. That would be kind of troubling. Just thinking out loud.
What did I write?
No, that's funny. All right, well, good deal. So we're getting there, man. We're getting through all the meaty stuff of Revelation, and wow, I can't wait to hear what this one's all about. I'll tell you what, the last few have been pretty heavy hitters anyway. Revelation, like I said before, was the one I was waiting on the longest for, and now this here, I'm really enjoying it. So, yeah.
Well, it doesn't make two of us.
You're like, get this thing on the over.
I was also waiting to dig into this book, but I find it almost impossible to understand. You know, what's interesting is that most of us today, at least people who've been exposed to evangelical theology and evangelical writing, you know, there are so many different parts of the Christian world that look at this book so differently. But I would imagine that most of the viewers are probably people who've had some exposure to the evangelical world, and they already have not necessarily one singular way of looking at this book, but more or less sort of a similar approach among most evangelicals. Not the same again, that they differ in many ways, but they sort of have a general approach to the book which is similar. And the problem, I think, is that if you're trying to read this book on your own, it's hard to disregard all of that prior information. It's like when you have these trials and the judge, you know, tells the jury, strike that. Don't listen to what that guy just said.
Right.
You know, the reality is that when, you know, you've heard something, it doesn't go away. So I find it difficult to understand this book, and what complicates my understanding is all of the interference that comes up from, you know, all of the sort of standard understanding that evangelicals have. But anyway, I'm going to try to just share a few thoughts.
So before you do that, two things. Number one, I would like to send you a great refuah shlema from me and all the viewers, and glad you're feeling better this week, and hoping for you a speedy full recovery soon.
Thank you. I think I was the last person in Toronto to catch COVID.
Wow. That's fun. So, the second thing is regarding this whole thing. You know, the one claim that keeps coming up, and it will keep coming up indefinitely, is that the reason why it's cloudy is because you don't have the Holy Spirit. How would you quickly respond to that?
Well, I take offense to that. Who's saying that? No, obviously Christians would insist that, you know, as someone who does not believe in Jesus, I don't have the Holy Spirit. But that's sort of irrelevant, because, you know, this is a program that's called, you know, a rabbi's perspective on, you know, these writings. And I don't need to have a Christian Holy Spirit to have a, you know, rabbi's perspective on what we're reading. So I find it sort of irrelevant. I understand that the Christian could always say, well, you don't really understand it, which is fine, you know.
Right. That's right. Okay, good deal.
Yeah. I think that oftentimes, you know, an outsider's misunderstanding might be better than the insider's understanding.
Right.
So basically, chapter 16, which we covered the last time that we met, dealt with the judgments that were symbolized by what was poured out from these 7 bowls that these 7 angels carried. And each angel poured out this bowl of God's judgments upon the world. And in chapter 17, we're going to basically focus in a little bit. And we'll start with the first verse. The first verse says, "And one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, 'Come here, I shall show you the judgment of the great harlot, the great whore, who sits on many waters.'" So I wanted to begin by just pointing out, and we've mentioned this several times already, that what you have here is supposedly one of these angels coming and speaking to John. And what we need to pay attention to is who John does not hear from. When you go through Revelation, he hears from a number of different angels, but just like in the rest of the books of the Christian Bible, we don't hear God speaking. John does not hear directly from God. Obviously, the belief is that whatever he's hearing from the angels is a revelation from God, but it's significant that there's no direct communication by God to John, or anyone else for that matter, in the Christian Bible. And this is significant because in the TaNaCh, in the Hebrew scriptures, God's prophets normally hear from him. And in the Gospels and the epistles and the other writings of the Christian Bible, God never speaks. That's something to just consider, to think about. So the great harlot spoken about here will be explicitly identified later on in verse 5, because all we're told here is there's some kind of a great harlot. But the identity of this woman is alluded to back in chapter 14, verse 8, and I'll quote that verse. So it said there that another angel followed, saying, "Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she has made all the nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." So basically, no one believes that this is referring to the actual ancient city of Babylon. And so it's clearly Babylon here is symbolic of something. And what exactly it is code for is not exactly clear. It may become clearer as we go along. So in verse 2, John writes, continuing, I guess, the message of this angel, "with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality." So this immorality is understood by most Christian writers as a kind of spiritual adultery and religious apostasy, meaning even though the language here is sexual, speaking about a harlot and immorality, but it's not so much a sexual immorality as a spiritual immorality, a religious apostasy. And that's basically the effect. That's the what's coming out of this, well, at least the code here, the city of Babylon, which again is identified with this woman, with this harlot. Now, we find this imagery actually in the TaNaCh as well. This imagery of promiscuity, really referring to a kind of spiritual adultery. And basically, we would call that idolatry. So, for example, in Jeremiah chapter 3, in verse 9, it speaks about, in very interesting language, committing adultery with stones and trees. Now, obviously, committing adultery with stones and trees, it's referring to the kind of idols and altars and pagan worship that you would have through wood and stone. And actually, in Deuteronomy also, we have this reference to, wood and stone as representing the kind of pagan worship that we're warned against becoming involved in. And we also find this imagery of promiscuity and adultery and this kind of sexual immorality as representing idolatry and spiritual heresy. So we find it in a number of chapters in Ezekiel, for example, very prominently in Ezekiel chapter 16. You see it in Hosea chapter 4, a little bit in Hosea chapter 5, and again, many other places in TaNaCh. This is an imagery and sort of symbolism that we're already familiar with. And what John is describing here is a worldwide spiritual rebellion against God. It's a worldwide, because he says, those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. So it's not just the kings of the earth who committed acts of immorality. That's how verse 2 begins. It's all those who dwell on the earth. It's a worldwide spiritual rebellion against God. We saw that in the previous chapters, it described the massive sway that would be had by Satan and the Antichrist, and that the world would basically come to worship Satan and the Antichrist. Of course, as we've pointed out before, and I'm going to mention this a number of times now, this is an end-time scenario which is simply not in the TaNaCh. There's nothing in the TaNaCh about a worldwide rejection of God and worship of Satan or worship of an Antichrist. This is simply something which does not align, and it has no continuity. There's nothing in common with the way the TaNaCh paints the end time scenarios. So in verse 3, John goes on and says, and he, obviously this angel, he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. So again, most commentaries here see this woman who's sitting on this scarlet beast. She is identified as the harlot back in verse 1. And the beast is the Antichrist, which is, again, the way this beast is portrayed and identified back in chapter 13 of Revelation. So in verse 4, John goes on to say, and the woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality. Now, many of the Christian commentaries point out that this imagery of having this gold cup in her hand really sort of echoes what you find in Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 7. So if you look at that passage in Jeremiah, he speaks of Babylonia as a golden cup in the hand of the Lord, which intoxicated all the land, and nations would drink from its wine, and the nations would become crazed. So the question is there any commonality, any continuity between what Jeremiah is describing in terms of Babylonia being this golden cup in the hand of the Lord, and what John writes about here in the 17th chapter of Revelation? And it doesn't really take a lot of work. By studying in context Jeremiah chapters 50, the whole chapter, 50 and 51, so it's very clear that he's describing the destruction of the nation that destroyed the first temple and exiled the Jews about 500 BCE. And it's not, Jeremiah is not sharing with us an end-time vision, an end-time prophecy that has any connection with John's vision whatsoever. So in verse 5, John goes on to say, again, about this woman, and upon her forehead the name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. So we see here, again, in Revelation, that Babylon is not so much a physical location, but it's an archetype. Babylon is really an archetype for spiritual pollution and heresy, and what most Christians describe as what they describe as false religion. And it's coming out of this, I guess Babylon was a center of paganism, so even though it may not necessarily be a city at that point or in any point along the way now that's a real location where this is the actual center of paganism, but at one point it was, and so it becomes symbolic of heresy, of idolatry, of paganism, of false religion. And in verse 6, John says, and I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered greatly. So it seems that the source of spiritual rebellion against God can not tolerate the true followers of God and seek to kill them. So that's what's going on here, that this woman apparently is not only promulgating this false spirituality and these heretical beliefs, rejection of God, embracing of essentially what we see in Revelation. It's embracing the Satan and the Antichrist, but this spiritual force that's represented by this woman from Babylon, this force from the spiritual force of Babylon, actually doesn't just spread heretical ideas, but it literally seeks to kill anyone that embraces God. And so that's what the verse says. Some Christian commentaries suggest that the saints that are mentioned here are referring to the righteous people from the Old Testament, from the TaNaCh, and the witnesses of Jesus are his followers that begin in the Christian Bible. Now, heading on to verse 7, it says, and the angel said to me, why do you wonder? I shall tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. And in verse 8, the angel goes on to explain, the beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss and to go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth will wonder, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast, that he was and is and will come. I'm sorry, he was and is not and will come. By the way, I'm reading from the New American Standard translation of the Christian Bible, the NASB. So this is an incredibly difficult verse to understand. It's almost impossible to understand. Christian commentaries understand this passage in numerous ways. However, the basic contours of this verse paint a picture, this is the point I wanted to make, that is basically totally out of sync with the end-time prophecies of the TaNaCh. There's nothing in the TaNaCh about a worldwide deception by an antichrist or by Satan who will corrupt everyone except for those people who were predestined to stay pure. This is simply not in the TaNaCh. And we'll discuss in a little while really the main ruptures between what you see here in Revelation and what God revealed in the TaNaCh. So in verse 9, it continues, "Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits." Now, many evangelical commentaries assume that this is a reference to Rome, which sat on 7 hills. Actually, remember when I went to Rome a number of years ago, the tour guides pointed this out, the 7 hills upon which Rome was built. And many tie this connection to Rome with between this whore of Babylon, the connection between this whore of Babylon and Rome. They also see this in verse 18, which is at the end of this chapter, which says, "The woman that you saw is the great city." So the woman represents the city. The woman is not just a woman. She represents the city, and the city that rules over the kings of the earth. Now, what is the city that rules over the kings of the earth? So again, many readers assume, well, it's got to be speaking about Rome. That's the most powerful city whose influence goes over the entire earth. And again, that would correspond with this idea of the 7 heads and the 7 mountains on which the woman sits, representing the 7 hills of Rome. Although we'll see that other Christian commentaries say that no, this city upon which rules over the kings of the earth, it is still referring back to Babylon. So again, there's no unanimity in terms of how Christians understand this verse. And in verse 10, "And they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is, the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain a little while." Again, very, very difficult to understand what in the world this is referring to. So you have several approaches. One is to say that this reference to 7 kings is referring to 7 major world empires. And the 5 that are referred to as ones that have fallen, so that's seen as referring to Egypt and Assyria and Babylonia and the Persian Medes and Greece. Those would be the 5 kingdoms that have already fallen, meaning that they've passed in terms of the historical timeline. The one that is, meaning the one that's presently existing, that would refer to the Roman Empire. And the one that is not yet is referring to, apparently, according to many Christian commentaries, the kingdom of the Antichrist, which is not yet, or some say the revived Roman Empire, which again is often identified with the kingdom of the Antichrist. Others, though, say that these 7 kings are not referring to 7 historical political kingdoms, but are referring to 7 Roman emperors. And they try to identify who are the 7 Roman emperors, who are the 5 that are already passed, who is the one that's presently speaking of, who is the one that has not yet come. So in verse 11, John says, "And the beast which was and is not is himself also an 8th, and is one of the 7." Now this gets very, very, very murky and difficult to understand, that the beast which was and is not, that phrase itself is perplexing, is himself also an 8th, and is one of the 7. Again, seems to be a bit of a conundrum, and he goes to destruction. So again, this is not at all clear. Some say that the Antichrist is this final king, and it's referring to his apparent resurrection from the fatal wound that he received that we read about earlier in the book of Revelation. And this would be somehow the 7th king and the 8th king, the 7th king when he was first here, and the 8th king after his resurrection. Again, very difficult to somehow come up with a linear reading of these verses that really makes a lot of sense. And in verse 12, "And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, who have not received a kingdom, but they received authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour." So apparently these 10 kings that receive authority with the beast are sort of sub-rulers under the domain of the Antichrist. And we see this in verse 13, which says, "These have one purpose," meaning these 10 kings have one purpose, "and they give their power and authority to the beast." So somehow they are part of the administration and the power structure of the beast. Now, verse 14 is an important verse for our discussion today. Verse 14 says, "They will wage war against the Lamb." So again, the waging of the war done here is by these 10 kings, and the beast, the Antichrist, will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is the Lord of lords and King of kings. And those who are with him are the called and chosen and faithful. So there are several things that we need to point out about this verse. Number 1, as we've seen, since we actually began going through the Christian scriptures, beginning with the book of Matthew, we've covered quite a bit of ground. What we've seen is, and I've always tried to point this out, a consistent distinguishing between Jesus and God. Definitely a consistent distinguishing between Jesus and God, with the understanding that Jesus was seen essentially as an intermediary to God, but most certainly not to be confused with the Creator himself. Not to be confused with what in Hebrew we call the Tetragrammaton, the Yud, He, Vav, He, the specific reference to God Almighty, the Creator. That seems to have been virtually throughout the Christian writings. We've seen this failure to identify Jesus with the Creator, and a consistent distinguishing him from the Creator. However, we saw a handful of murky verses that are not so clear. And you could read them as pointing to possibly a more elevated view of Jesus. And this would be one of them, possibly. Now, it certainly sounds like they're describing the Lamb here, and the Lamb is always understood to be Jesus, as the Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Who else could it be talking about? But we've seen before in our discussions that the word Lord does not necessarily refer to the Creator. When you read English translations of the Hebrew Bible, Lord can simply be a term of respect you have for great leaders. And one of the reasons that I would suggest that it does not refer to the Creator here is because it has this expression of Lord of Lords, right? I mean, it seems to be using the word Lord here not as a designation of the Creator, because then Lord of Lords would not make any sense. It would seem to be saying that he is a great ruler, a great king, the King of Kings, meaning of all the kings in history, they're describing in this verse Jesus as the greatest of the kings. But that would not make him God the Creator. This is just something to think about. The second thing I think we need to think about in terms of this verse is that in the TaNaCh, the end time picture, meaning that the view that we get of the future end times, what's going to be going on, is one where the world goes to war against Israel. That's the basic scenario of the end times that we find in TaNaCh, where the entire world comes together and goes up to battle against Israel. And the Mashiach plays a role in being God's agent to vanquish the enemies of Israel. That's basically what you find going on in the TaNaCh. And what is not pictured in the TaNaCh, what you don't find in TaNaCh, is a war against the Messiah. You don't see this in the TaNaCh, where the whole world gets together and they go to war against the Messiah. That's what you see here in verse 14, that they will wage war against the Lamb. You don't see Israel really playing the central place that we find in the end time scenarios in the TaNaCh. In the TaNaCh, it all revolves around God's chosen people, the people of Israel, and how they will fare amongst the nations of the world. And you certainly don't see in the TaNaCh, as I mentioned, anything about a worldwide rejection of God and worship of Satan. And part of the problem here, part of this great chasm between the Christian view of the end times and the Jewish view of the end times, is based upon the Christian distortion of the concept of Satan. That in the Christian view, Satan is seen as the adversary of God, who essentially leads a war against God. This is how Satan is viewed in the Christian Bible. And certainly here in the book of Revelation, Satan is the leader of this worldwide rebellion against God. In the TaNaCh, it's very important to remember Satan is on God's team. Again, in the Christian Bible, Satan is the leader of the team that's fighting against God. certainly not on God's team. In the TaNaCh, it's very clear that Satan is an angel of God, a servant of God, who is on God's team. He serves God's purposes. So this whole idea of a worldwide worship of Satan, a rebellion against God, a war against the Messiah, it paints a picture which we simply do not find at all in the TaNaCh. So verse 15 is, we're going to basically conclude the chapter now. And he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues, meaning that this is the worldwide influence that this woman, who again represents the spiritual apostasy of Babylon, this false religious system, it's going to take over the world. And in verse 16, it says, and the 10 horns which you saw and the beast, these will hate the harlot and will make her desolate and naked and will eat her flesh and will burn her up with fire. Now, this, of course, is a verse that is extremely difficult to understand. And I'll just share what many evangelical Christians commentaries understand this to mean. Basically, is that the Antichrist had been using this false religious system, this spiritual religion that is, again, represented by the harlot of Babylon. The Antichrist was simply using it as a way to seize control over the entire world. But once it served that purpose, meaning once this spiritual system served that purpose, the Antichrist will destroy this religious system and seize all power for itself, meaning it was basically simply using this spiritual, this, I guess, powerful spiritual system of false spirituality. It became a tool in the hands of Satan and in the hands of the Antichrist. And once it served the purpose of uniting the whole world under the rule of the Antichrist basically has no longer any use for this spiritual system and destroys it, basically throws it out the window. And many of the Christian commentaries speak about replacing sort of this spiritual world order with a more nefarious political world order that's purely secular, has no spiritual side to it. And it's explained in verse 17, for God had put it in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose and by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God should be fulfilled, meaning that this apparently is all part of God's plan, that the fake, false spiritual system of Babylon will be destroyed by Satan. So here you have the evil forces of Satan and the Antichrist destroying the evil forces of this false religion. And again, as we mentioned, the very end of the chapter writes that this woman you saw, this is what John is being told now, is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. So again, some identify this great city as Rome, others identify it as Babylon, and some identify it really as a continuum, meaning that it was some kind of a spiritual movement that was false, that began in Babylon and basically was transferred to Rome. Rome now becomes the symbol of this false spiritual system that, again, will ultimately be destroyed, as we see in verse 16. So I find this chapter to be almost impenetrable, very hard to understand. But there are, again, a number of features that we need to just bear in mind in terms of how different this is, how out of sync this is from what God actually revealed in the TaNaCh.
All right. Sorry. Hands are all over the place. Very good. Interesting chat today. So, of course, it's always interesting. That's good for the business. Yes, indeed. So, okay, so Revelation 18 next week. And then if
hopefully.
Hopefully next week. Yeah, Baruch Hashem, that you will be fully restored and also available. So, Rabbi Michael Skobac, you are amazing. And guys, you can find him, of course, at JewsForJudaism.ca for more of his content there. And one of these days, he'll be writing a book, maybe, of his journey and how he got into this whole mess of defending Judaism against Christianity and other religions. So that'd be kind of cool. All right, Rabbi, I guess you didn't see that coming. I didn't either, actually. So y'all have a great week, Rabbi. You be well as well, and we'll see you guys soon. Take care, everybody.
Thanks so much. All the best, and God bless you.
Thank you, too. Bye-bye. Shalom, my dear friends. Hope this message finds you well. If you like the way this channel is going, and the channel has been a blessing to you, please consider supporting the channel by going to the website, TaNachTalk.com, TaNachTalk.com. Thank you once again for your time and for supporting TaNaCh Talk. Shalom.
חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה